couple of baseball-related cliches. So first off, he, for better or worse, made the trade deadline and switching up advisors. So if you love this presentation, it's because of the advising he received from Lieutenant Colonel Smith. I'm sort of the pinch guy because Smith is on leave. Actually, I'll just stop there. I'll turn it over to Reeves. He's going to talk about baseball in Richmond, Virginia. So there it is.
All right, thank you guys for coming out. Last day before spring break. I'm glad you guys could all make it. Thank you to Colonel Allen for being my advisor for the second half of this. And thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Smith too, that he's not here. He had to be at Langley, the Air Force Base for a family matter. But as Colonel Allen said, I'm talking about baseball. It's my presentation on what it costs to play baseball. Specifically, I'll be looking at the big picture. Should local governments and cities be willing to subsidize sports teams to come there? And in this presentation, I'll be looking at Richmond. Specifically, should the city of Richmond be willing to subsidize the minor league team, the Flying Squirrels, to build a new stadium? So just so that we're all on the same page, get started. I don't know what major everyone is in here, but subsidy is just any benefit that a government is willing to give to a private institution. That can be either through a tax break or just like a lump sum payment. In this case, we're looking at the city of Richmond giving the Flying Squirrels just one lump sum payment. Okay, so a little background on Richmond. This is looking at the Richmond Metropolitan Statistical Area. You can see the population's up there, just a little background on the city. In 2012, it was voted the best river town in the entire country. It has a relatively young population with 20% below the age of 18 and 90% below the age of 65. There are two major colleges, VCU and U of R, with a variety of smaller colleges throughout the city. The median income in 2017 was $67,000, and if you compare that population to other cities about that size for the whole metropolitan statistical area, it has a similar population to Jacksonville, Indianapolis, Denver, which all have at least one major sports team, and Richmond has none. Okay, so then we're looking at the Diamond. The Diamond, if you're from Richmond, I'm sure you've seen it, it's kind of a staple of downtown. It was originally built in 1985 for the baseball team that was here at that time, which was the Richmond Braves. They were here for about 40 years. Had continual complaints with the stadium after the stadium was about 20 years old, and finally in 2008 they called it quits and left. That was the first time Richmond hadn't had baseball in about 50 years. So in 2010, the Flying Squirrels moved back in, a lower level of baseball, not as good, not as many people caught support. And although they haven't asked yet, I imagine soon they'll also be asking for some upgrades to the stadium because nothing has been done. So you might be thinking, who cares about baseball in Richmond? If a team left, why does that really matter? And the only reason that's really kind of worth looking at just because continually surveys show that Richmonders want baseball specifically. The Braves were a pretty popular team. They had some record attendance numbers for their minor league. And so when they left, it was kind of a blow. The Flying Squirrels have started to fill that void, but not entirely. So the first thing I did when beginning this project was go to talk to the Richmond Economic and Community Development Council. And they gave me this picture, which I really kind of wasn't expecting. The entire red outline is 60 acres that the Diamond sits on and that the city owns. So this quickly went from looking just at the stadium, which I initially assumed was all that the city had access to looking at this entire property. Something also worth noting is that soccer field right there is owned by VCU. And so a large assumption that I make in this research is that the city can just move that soccer stadium, the school can move it somewhere else. Talking a little bit with the Richmond Economic and Community Development Council, that wouldn't be an issue. They have some other sites that they've looked at, and they've already talked to VCU a little bit about moving the stadium. So the other big thing that the council gave me was a report from Tripp Umbach. That is a consulting firm based in Pittsburgh, where they came down and they looked at the best way to redevelop this 60 acres. And that proved to be massively helpful. I didn't think I'd be getting that. They had a ton of numbers for different types of businesses that should move in, infrastructure costs, demolition costs, etc. So that was a huge help, and you'll see me reference them many times in this presentation. Okay, so then we start to look at specific subsidy, whether or not Richmond to subsidize the Flying Squirrels. When subsidies in general, there are two kind of big approaches right now. The first approach is paid for by the team that's coming to the city, and I'm sure all of you guys can see the flaw in that. It's usually very biased. They have an incentive to show that the team would bring in a lot of money and jobs to the community. And one way they show this is that they don't leave out double counting. And so double counting is when basically Richmond right now, the Flying Squirrels have a certain attendance in every game. And so a new stadium would not get credit for the attendance that already comes to the current stadium, if that makes sense. So you can only count new attendance brought in by a new stadium. And that's something that most approaches that are paid for by the team leave out in order to try and show that there's be a bigger impact than there is. The second approach is a very skeptical approach. It's done after the stadium is built. This usually only accounts for ticket sales and concession sales, and it concludes that stadiums are a drain. And this is kind of the prevailing consensus in the community right now, which I was familiar with when I started this project. And that kind of led to one of my big questions. If stadiums are such a drain, why do cities keep subsidizing them? Because we see between 1998 and 2002, there was about $8 billion worth of stadiums and arenas built, and $4 billion of that came through subsidies. So it's pretty prevalent to give a subsidy. And if the consensus is such a drain, I was wondering why does this keep happening? So that kind of fueled a lot of my research. So this study, how it's different, as you can see up here, I do basically some cost-benefit analysis. And I look a lot at the development that comes around, as well as the additional attendance. And yeah, that's really everything I did. The results can't be applied to all the cities, which is a big thing, but the method can. This is very specific to Richmond. All the numbers will be very specific to Richmond. So this doesn't really come up with a big picture conclusion, but you can use the method with other cities if you wanted to. My personal bias is I'm from Richmond, so in general I'd like to see the city do well, but I try to leave any bias out when collecting my data. So when I conducted the cost-benefit analysis, the first thing I did was collect the costs. I wanted to see how much it would cost to build a new stadium. I did this by looking at the cost per seat. I looked at other stadiums that have been built in minor leagues in the past 20 years. And this is their capacity and the cost. I just found the cost per seat. It was pretty simple. And that is the capacity of Richmond right now, about 9,500 people. And so when you multiply that by the cost per seat, which is just above 5,000, that is my total cost of construction for a new stadium. Next, we looked at the cost of infrastructure, and this came from the Triple-Block analysis. They had all of this built into it, so that made my job really easy. The analysis was done in 2016, so all I did was just for inflation, and this is how much the infrastructure around the stadium would cost in millions, so about $26.5 million. This is the total cost. Demolition, as I said, also from Triple-Block, already in there. That made it easy. There's the construction cost that I calculated, and the infrastructure. So my total cost for this project would end up being about $77,700,000. So a pretty big cost. That was the easy part of this research. Next came the source of benefits, and this is kind of what makes this research a little unique, and this was really the interesting part. So the first source of benefits is an increased amount of ticket sales, which comes from the honeymoon effect. The honeymoon effect occurs really with any new source of entertainment for the public. It's just the excitement that comes from it. Usually there's about a 40% increase in attendance the first year, and that slowly decreases over the next 8 years until there's no longer any benefit from an increased number of ticket sales. Next, look at the value of public good that comes with a sports team. I did this through the CVM, which is the contingent valuation method. This is from Bruce Johnson and John Whitehead. They're two economists that really focus on the CVM method, and this is basically a group of surveys to try and find out, you survey the public and try and find out what they value things like intangibles such as pride, community, culture, being able to talk about how a sports team did, what the results are, where they're going, that kind of thing, players, trading, all of that, you'd find the value, public good values in the CVM. And so I used one that was done in Lexington, Kentucky by Johnson and Whitehead to see how a minor league stadium would do there. And then finally, I looked at development that would occur around the stadium. Most of this came from the Trip Unbox survey. It includes things such as property tax on new developments that are coming to the area, sales tax, state income tax, and finally all that was put through a multiplier. A multiplier determines how much of each paycheck these new employees spend out in the community. So ultimately, how much of it comes back to Richmond and becomes a benefit to the city. This was used a system called RIMS 2 that we got in the grant. Okay, so first, the analysis I ran was just ticket sales and nothing else. This is using that honeymoon effect. And as you can see, this is pretty much right in line with a lot of that approach number 2, where people are skeptical. This is all negative in case you didn't pick up on that. There's can see 0, it doesn't come close to breaking even. It's pretty drastic, but I think it kind of proves a point and shows that a lot of people who do this survey or this study are correct in saying that just through ticket sales within the stadium itself is an economic drain, and there's no point in bringing a new stadium to any city. And as you can see, the honeymoon effect is that only increased for 8 years, then it levels off because that is where we get to double counting, which we tried really hard to exclude in order to get an accurate result. So next, I kept in that increased ticket sales, and I added the value of public good. So using that CDM approach that was done in Weston, Kentucky, they determined that the public good was about 90 cents per person. In order to create kind of a conservative estimate of what the stadium's worth, I only used the non-use value, and that means that people who don't even go to games get about 90 cents of benefit per person out of having a stadium in the community. Obviously that's higher if the person goes to the games, and there's a bunch of different levels of that stadium analysis, and I'll mention it later on, but going forward, if we were to continue this project, it'd be important to do that in Richmond to find out exactly what Richmonders value this sort of entertainment at. But as you can see again, pretty standard, pretty typical, doesn't really come close to breaking even. So we conclude again here, there would be no reason to bring in a new stadium to Richmond. So my next slide is where it gets pretty interesting. This is with full development, and it shoots up, breaks even after about year 2. I made an assumption here that 50% of the employees that work in these new businesses were previously unemployed, because obviously if they were already employed, we get into that double counting again, so I wanted to try and exclude a lot of them. This is a big assumption, but later on I'll kind of play with that number some. This is kind of the baseline data here. So the Trip Unbox survey suggested like certain development that was very specific and very useful, which is why I was comfortable using it. And so I just had the list of what would come around the stadium. There would be 4 bars, 3 family restaurants, 2 cafes, 1 hotel, 1 grocery store, a general store, an apartment building, a small row of townhouses, and 10 urban boutiques, which can be anything from flower shops to dry cleaners. I only used data from the bars, family dining, cafes, and the grocery store and general store because that was the most reliable data that I could find. So that's what's included here. This looks at the employees, how much sales or how much tax, personal income tax they pay, as well as just the property tax on those locations. I found out about how much that would be by looking at the average size of any of these, say a bar, looking at the average size of a bar downtown. Then I could go online to the richmond.gov website and look at current property values, and I made sure to adjust for inflation and make sure everything was in 2018. So this is just kind of a big chart of where the benefits are coming from. It's a little bit interesting and kind of makes it clear, as you can see, just kind of the idea of pride and the impact from ticket sales play less than a quarter of the benefits. So if you were to just include those things in studies, you would see that's not worth it. What's key here is that development occurs around it. And that's what brought me to kind of something in this project that I didn't anticipate happening, but did. It was pretty interesting. I went from just thinking that we'd be looking at the stadium and ticket sales, at different benefits, at salaries of players, to becoming almost more of an urban development type project. Because it became clear that there was no way that it would be worth it to have a stadium unless there was a guarantee that development would come around it. Another key assumption that I make is that the stadium has to be the anchor for the community, because you can only associate the benefits from surrounding development with the stadium if you can say that the stadium was the main reason they came to the area. And this may seem like a big assumption, but if you go back to the map, of the 60 acres in general. There's no development there right now, essentially. And if you live in Richmond, I'm sure you've been down there. It's really not the best place to be after dark. It's kind of a sketchy area. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that if a new stadium was built and we brought in this development intentionally centered around the stadium and made the stadium one of the main selling points for moving to the area, that there would be an increased amount of development. And I'm confident that the trip unlock report kind of reflects accurately what would be the best to move in there. So this is just kind of comparing all the different levels of benefits so you can kind of see the big jump from development. And then this was the 5-year zone, just to make it easier to look at. You can see it breaks even after about 3 years. For those of you that are unfamiliar with just the cost-benefit analysis, basically once you break even, once the overall cost outweighs the benefits, and you can say that it's theoretically it's worth bringing in that cost. So that gets to the big question, kind of the overall research question: should the city of Richmond subsidize the stadium? And with these assumptions that I have in place right now, the answer is yes. It should be up to the full cost because it breaks even so quick. And that comes out to about $62 per person in the entire MSA. What happens a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, is that full subsidy doesn't happen. It's usually about half. So while this says that theoretically, with economic theory, it should be worth it for them to pay for the entire thing, that's not suggesting that they have to pay for the entire thing. There's a lot of room for policymakers to break that down to if they're just paying half, a quarter, whatever they think is best for the area. So finally, assuming that 50% of the population appears to be unemployed is a big assumption, I decided to kind of play with some of my assumptions to see if it would how accurate, how realistic is it that this is a worthwhile project. And once my model is built, I can do that pretty easily. So here, you see that I dropped the assumptions from 50% of the employees that come to the area being unemployed to just 25%, and you still see overall it's worth it. To me, this is one of the reasons research is significant, because you can really play with that, with the numbers, to see how the payoff looks. Another assumption, this time I had only half the development that is predicted to come to the area coming. Still significant, still worthwhile, it breaks even after about year 10. And then finally, have only 10% of the new employees coming in were previously unemployed, and only half the development occurs. This is a little more discouraging. It doesn't break even for a while, but this is, again, I'm still accounting for paying for the entire thing. You can easily move that up about halfway. The city would only pay for half of it, and that would move back to being breaking even after about 10 years. And the research that I read, most stadiums have a life of about 20 years, so it would still be worth it in the long run. So finally, moving forward, if I was to continue to work with this project and continue to do research, there are a couple of big things that would need to happen next. We would need more accurate, as you just saw with those graphs hopefully, a lot of this depends on how many people are previously unemployed, because we're trying really hard to avoid that double counting. I didn't have time to do the research to really look into exactly how many people would most likely be unemployed prior to coming over to these new developments. You can also look at level of development that would actually happen. This analysis was done in 2016 by Trip Unlock, so that could have changed. It'd be important to do it again to be sure before making this investment. Another big thing I mentioned earlier is the CVM survey would need to be done for Richmond. Because that's another big part of it. It was done for Lexington, Kentucky at a minor league stadium, and there are obviously some differences between Richmond and Lexington, Kentucky. I think that the Richmond would probably get more benefit from the stadium. They're a relatively large population, like I said, compared to some cities such as Jacksonville, Denver, Indianapolis, that have no major sports team. So personally, I believe that if a stadium survey was conducted, we would find that Richmonders get a lot more benefit just from pride and culture of having, and status in the city of having a large sports team here. And finally, it'd be important to analyze the individuals who would actually move to the housing developments that were to develop on that 60 acres. This was something that I think is really interesting, and will probably be where I went next. But if you are trying to develop housing there, and it's mostly geared more towards low-income housing. Obviously, the amount that people spent in the restaurants and the boutiques that come up in the area would be significantly less than if you were to have it be more for the upper working class or even just the middle class. So there's a lot of kind of variation in there that would play a role. So if I was to continue working with this, I would look specifically at Richmond to try and look at who would most likely move in, and a lot of that would just be who developers geared towards. So the city would have a little bit of a role in deciding that. And finally, something the survey, this study did not capture, but it's worth mentioning, is that kind of back to double counting, a lot of people that are going to these things will probably be spending their money at the ball game and the development around it instead of going bowling or to the movies. This is something that I wasn't able to capture. If I was to continue to work, I would certainly try and find out how many consumers are we stealing from other different types of entertainment. That probably plays a large role and is worth looking at going forward. So that's my senior thesis. I had a good time doing it. It was a lot of fun. For those of you that will be doing one in the future, I recommend doing something you enjoy. I was kind of lucky to find a place in sports economics because I'm kind of a sports guy and that's what I enjoyed. I'm looking forward to any questions.